All right, let's talk about the hidden feedback loop that is controlling your money. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, you feel it. Mortgages, car loans, your credit card bills, they all get more expensive. It's usually viewed as the tough medicine we have to take to fight inflation and cool down an overheating economy. But what if I told you that's not the full story? I talked a few weeks ago about the stagflationary environment from the 70s and 80s that we might be walking into again. But there's also a lesser known feedback loop that we need to talk about, one that exists between the Fed and the government's own finances. A loop where the very act of fighting today's inflation could be paving the way for higher taxes and a weaker dollar in your future. So stick around because you're about to see how money is being controlled in a way you've probably never thought of. All right, let's start with the part you already know. The economy is running hot, prices are climbing too fast, and something has to be done. So the Federal Reserve steps in and raises rates, just like they started doing back in 2022. But what do economists and talking heads actually mean? A lot of people think when we talk about the Fed raising or lowering rates, that they have direct control over things like mortgage interest rates. But that's not entirely accurate. What the Fed controls is its main interest rate. It's called the federal funds rate. It's the target rate that banks charge each other to borrow money overnight, and its effects ripple through the whole economic system. You might be thinking, why are banks borrowing money from each other overnight? What does that even mean? My bank closes at like 3:17 p.m., so what's going on in those places in the middle of the night? Here's the simple version. Imagine you and a group of friends are constantly sending money back and forth, splitting dinners, covering Ubers, grabbing concert tickets. But there's one rule. By the end of every day, everyone has to have at least $100 in their Venmo account. No exceptions. That way, everyone knows that every friend has a baseline to help cover expenses. No claiming you can't afford it, no ghosting when you choose something too expensive on the menu. No one ends up being that one friend always stuck paying. Inevitably, some people end the day short. Others have extra cash just because of how the activities of the day played out. So around 10 p.m., the texts start going out. Hey, can you spot me $40 until tomorrow? And someone says, yeah, I got you, but if I'm giving you 40, I want 41 back. That little extra dollar is interest. The going rate that everyone settles into is the federal funds rate. Now scale that up. Those friends are banks, and those Venmo balances are their required cash reserves. That nightly scramble to not come up short is happening every day in the banking system. Banks that are short borrow from banks that have extra, just to make it through the night. So where does the Federal Reserve come in? Think of the Fed like the one super influential friend in the group. They're not in every single transaction, but they pay attention to what everyone is doing, how people are feeling. And when they speak, people adjust. If the Fed says money has been too easy lately, people start charging more to lend. That $40 turns into 42, 43, maybe even 45. If the Fed wants to loosen things up, the opposite happens. People ease off, and that 40 might only cost $40.25 to pay back. And here's where it actually starts to affect behavior. When borrowing that $40 suddenly costs 45, people think twice. Maybe if they don't cover dinner tonight, maybe you skip the Uber and just drive. Maybe you don't go out at all. Spending slows down. But when it only costs $40.25 to pay back, it's a lot easier to say, yes, yeah, I'll cover it. And just like that, people start spending more freely again. Now zoom back to the real world. When it gets more expensive for banks to borrow money, even just overnight, they do the same thing. They pull back, they charge more, and they get pickier about who they lend to. And that's how it spreads to you. Because now your new mortgage rate is higher. A car loan costs more, and your credit card interest starts to climb. Now, quick nuance. Longer term loans, like mortgages, don't move perfectly with the Fed. They're tied more to 10-year Treasury expectations. But the Fed still matters because when it moves the overnight rate, it's sending a signal about where the economy is headed, and markets react to that signal. So at its core, the federal funds rate is simple. It's just the price banks charge each other to borrow money overnight, so nobody comes up short. But when that price changes, it doesn't stay in the banking system. It ripples outward into spending, borrowing, and ultimately your everyday life. Now, there's another layer to this system that usually gets less attention, not because it's hidden, but because it's easy to miss when you're only looking at one piece of the economic puzzle at a time. There is one borrower in our economic system who borrows more than anyone else, and it's not even close. It's the United States government. As of early 2026, the US national debt has exploded to nearly $39 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's more than $114,000 for every single person in the country. And just like you pay interest on your loans, the government pays interest on its debt. For years, when rates were near zero, that cost was manageable. When rates rise, the story gets a lot bleaker. Every time the Treasury has to borrow new money to pay off old debt, it does so at these newer higher rates. And suddenly, the interest payments on that $39 trillion start to skyrocket. So think of the US government like that one friend in the group who's always organizing everything, booking the big trips, covering concert tickets. They're constantly putting money out up front, not because they're trying to be reckless, but because they're coordinating things at a much bigger scale than everyone else. But because of that, they almost always spend more than they personally have sitting in their account. So they issue IOUs. Lend me money today and I'll pay you back with interest. That's basically what a treasury bond is. And when overnight borrowing costs rise, people demand more to lock up money for years too, which makes it more expensive for the government to keep funding everything. And just like before, behavior changes. If that friend has to offer a higher and higher return to get people to lend to them, it becomes more expensive to keep funding all of those big plans. The cost of borrowing goes up. Now again, scale that up. When it gets more expensive for the US government to borrow, it means higher interest costs, more pressure on federal budgets, and bigger, harder trade offs over time. And here's the part that most people miss. In your friend group, if someone keeps borrowing too much, eventually, what are people going to stop doing? They're going to stop lending. But with the government, it works a little differently, mostly because the bonds issued by the US government are currently considered one of the safest investments in the world, quite literally. If you study finance or if you go into any MBA program, when people model a risk-free rate of return, they tie it to treasuries. The United States does not default on its debt. At least that's the accepted truth right now. The Congressional Budget Office, though, projects that net interest costs alone will hit $1 trillion this year. That's about $2.8 billion paid in interest every single day. And over the next decade, the US is on track to spend a mind-boggling $16.2 trillion just on interest. Not what it borrowed, just the fee for having borrowed so much. And this is where that nasty feedback loop kicks in. First, the Fed raises interest rates to fight inflation. As of April, the federal funds rate is in the 3.5 to 3.25 range. Second, the government interest payments explode. Interest payments have already blown past spending on national defense and are set to be the third largest item in the budget, trailing only Social Security and Medicaid. Third, that explosion in interest spending blows a massive hole in the federal budget, making the annual deficit, the gap between what the government spends and what it collects in taxes, even bigger. And fourth, to cover that large deficit, the government really only has two choices: raise your taxes or go even deeper into debt. That's the loop. The action taken to solve one problem, inflation, creates another huge problem, a spiraling deficit fueled by interest costs. And the solutions to that problem have very real consequences for you and for me. So which path will the government choose? One response some people suggest in this situation is to increase taxes on higher earners. But let's just look at the math. Even the most aggressive structural tax increases on the highest earners might raise $200 to $400 billion a year. We've already established the annual deficit is running in the trillions. It doesn't close the gap, especially when you factor in behavioral changes that happen whenever tax policy shifts. So the path of least resistance is almost always to issue more debt. And as the country's total debt compared to the size of its economy, that debt to GDP ratio, climbs higher and higher, people and countries who buy that debt might start demanding even higher interest rates to protect themselves. They might start questioning whether it's such a sure thing that they'll get paid back. Higher deficits force more debt issuance. More debt forces higher rates to attract buyers. Higher rates make interest payments bigger. Bigger interest payments widen the deficit, and the government issues, you guessed it, even more debt. Economists call this a debt doom loop. The CBO projects that on our current path, debt held by the public will hit 120% of GDP by 2036, 10 years, and a shocking 175% by 2056. As the government soaks up all available money to fund its deficits, it will crowd out private investment, making it more expensive for businesses to build, for you to buy a home. The whole engine of economic growth can start to sputter. Economists are continuing to wave red flags all over the place on this, but most people in Washington, on Wall Street, and on Main Street are focused on short-term outcomes, which is why we just keep kicking the can down the road. So how does this reach into your wallet? There's two ways. One is obvious and one is sneakier. The first obvious one is potentially higher taxes on everyone. At some point, the US's debt could become so large that the only option left is to significantly raise taxes on everybody to pay the massive interest bill. We're not talking a small tweak. We're talking major hikes to income taxes, corporate taxes, or possibly brand new taxes that haven't even been thought of yet. The bill for all this borrowing will eventually come due. The question isn't if, it's which generation of taxpayer is going to get stuck with it. But the second is sneakier: currency devaluation. If raising taxes is politically impossible and markets won't buy more debt at reasonable rates, the Federal Reserve can be pressured to essentially print money to buy the government's debt. It's called debt monetization. When trillions of new dollars are created out of thin air, the value of every dollar in every account goes down. If you remember my sweet tea metaphor from a few weeks ago, a flood of water dilutes nearly all the flavor and your tea has barely any taste left. The result isn't just normal inflation. It's the risk of persistent runaway inflation. Your savings, your retirement funds, your paycheck, all losing purchasing power quietly, day by day. A tax that nobody has to vote on. As a financial planner and a student of economics, this subject, in my opinion, it may not materialize for another several decades, but it's not going to magically go away. We can't keep running an insane deficit, borrowing into oblivion, and playing political ping pong and expect the system to remain manageable. If nothing changes, the US economy will eventually pay the price. We've been taught to think of Fed policy, government borrowing, and everyday prices as separate conversations happening in different rooms, but they're all connected through one underlying system: the price of money. When the Fed raises rates, it's not just about credit cards or mortgages. It changes the cost of borrowing across the entire economy, including for the government itself. That feeds into how much interest the government pays, which affects deficits, which influences the trade-offs between spending, taxation, and borrowing. A feedback loop with no simple off switch. Now, economic growth, productivity, policy changes, that can all shift the trajectory, both good or bad. Nothing here is a guaranteed outcome, but it does highlight the question most people never get a clear view of. What happens when the cost of money itself becomes one of the biggest drivers of government spending? So the next time you hear the Fed is changing rates, remember, it's not just a banking story. It's a system-wide change that flows through mortgages, markets, and the government's own balance sheet. As always, I like to end on a biblical frame. And this one, I personally struggle not to give in to fear or frustration because the issues are obvious and very well established. I've talked in the past about always reframing where we find our hope when we're talking about money and economic uncertainty. And it's worth repeating that your hope is not located within economic health. It is anchored above in the creator, sustainer, and the savior of the world. But to leave it there as a follower of Jesus can seem a little hollow because we still interact with these realities and problems in real time. And that's always where my mind goes. Within a biblical framework, how do I think about budget deficits and tax policy and borrowing? One of the most quoted scriptures about money is that the borrower is slave to the lender in Proverbs 22. And that's wisdom that stretches to governments as much as individuals. So when it comes to everything I've talked about today, I've landed on 3 questions to ask myself. First, how does my heart react to these realities? I just said earlier that there is definitely a level of fear that all of this comes crashing down within my lifetime or within my kids' lifetime. And I have to admit that I'm fearful of losing purchasing power, of living in a time of deep economic unhealth. And if that's true, then there's some reliance on money that's present in my heart. So I need to actively be asking the Holy Spirit to free me of that and reorient my heart towards Him because I am fully dependent on Him for that. which he is faithful to give in his time and wisdom. Second, what can I control within this reality? My my decisions don't influence macroeconomic outcomes, but I can be wise with my money in the here and now, being sober minded about things like what kind of debt I take on and why. Am I living within my means for my good, my family's good, and His glory? And am I doing it in such a way that is an outworking of my faith and dependence on Him, not trying to control uncontrollable outcomes of the world economy? And third, what can I enjoy about God's character in this? I think it is right and good and helpful to recognize God's goodness and sovereignty in the economic health that the United States has experienced over the course of its history. That is not an accident, and it is within His control. It is not a commentary on God's inherent approval of the country as a whole or some sort of ridiculous, false prosperity gospel heretical nonsense. I think that's foolish and unbiblical, but that's a whole other can of worms that I won't get into right now. But I have enjoyed through absolutely nothing that I had to say over. I have enjoyed the fruits of living in a time and a place where economic prosperity on a macro global scale has afforded me incredible opportunities to build a career, to run a business, to own a home, all sorts of things. And there was a lot in my story of how that happened that is because of God's sovereignty, not because of me. And hear me, Jesus did not shed every drop of his blood on a Roman cross and endure the torture of God's wrath so that I could drive a nice car and live in a good neighborhood. He did it to save me and reconcile me to himself. And he is a good father who delights in his children and wants to give them good things because he is good. So I can enjoy the context of the present while being sober minded about the reality of how actions have consequences and we might feel some of them in the future. And he is sovereign over every bit of it. So I can enjoy his goodness in plenty and in want. We don't know what the future holds, and Jesus tells us not to be anxious about tomorrow. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. I can be studying that and find my hope in Jesus, and I'll continue to filter and understand governmental policy and institutional realities through that lens alone. See y'all next week.